as I've mentioned, this is the third in the events, and I'll just give a quick run through of where we've got to so far, so you've all got a bit of context if you've been part of it. So the first event, we looked at inequality in the context of COVID, and we had some really fantastic speakers, talked about the power of community activism and the potential for the sector to work more closely alongside trade unions, which is a strong part of the identity of the Northwest. And Lynn Collin has been, who's the Northwest TUC lead, has been a long partner and supporter of the conversations and pieces of work that we've done in the Northwest and in Liverpool City region where she's based. She's a core champion of the employers charter. It's called different things in different parts of the Northwest, but it's substantially the same document, and that's very much a piece of work from Lynn. We also heard about structural racial inequality within the sector and how power relations reproduce inequalities in our work. We heard about the deep interconnectors of health and lived experience and the importance of recognising that and the impact of trauma in our approaches to combating inequality. I think we've got a really clear sense for those of you, if you've had a chance to hear Farzana speaking around the nature of the impact of structural and racial inequality, and the way it works across time was a really strong element that I couldn't do justice to. And the reality and presence of the way Farzana explained that was wonderful to hear, if in the way she articulated it rather than the reality of what it meant. We then went on to discuss recovery in COVID in the context of inequality. And I know we're running over a little bit, so I'll cut short. But in terms of some of the findings from that, we'd like to pick up on some pieces of work and use those conversations going forward. But if you have not had a chance, have a look at the videos, and I'll ask Martin to paste the links into those 3 videos of the speakers that are from the first event. It's well worth your time. There was a couple of people who just felt that it had been life-changing for them, so I would encourage others to watch those videos. In the second event, we turned our attention to infrastructure organisations in the Northwest, and we see those as key levers to mobilising the wider voluntary and community sector and operating at place level. The event was, we recognised and celebrated the incredible amount that's been achieved since March, since COVID, and the way that the sector has responded to the emergency in all its many and varied aspects that's impacting on our communities. There's still a lot to do. We began to have those kind of formal recovery and reset conversations, and I think officially in the Northwest we had 4 days between wave 1 and wave 2, so there wasn't a lot of time. Those conversations are going on still, and we are still trying to input. They've just lost some of the momentum. So I think in the fourth event, which if you want to put in your diaries now, and I think we've sent the notice out with the 2 Northwest Metro mayors speaking on the 9th of December, I think from 4:15, we can begin to get a sense of what Building Back Better looks like, and whether that's the right terminology, and what the role of the sector in articulating what we think a reset looks like, or what no going back needs for a future that works for Northwest communities. So all the recordings from these events can be found on VSNW's YouTube channel, and we'll circulate links to those. So, but for now, we'll turn our attention to the future of the sector, looking beyond 2020, the name of today's event. We've got some fantastic guests lined up for this afternoon, representing some of the country's largest and arguably the sector's most important and influential funders. Certainly on a good list of 4 or 5 in my mind, at the very least. We've got innovative think tanks coming to speak, and we've got the lead author of Akivo's recent report on called Home Truths, which looks at undoing racism and delivering real diversity in the charity sector. And that's been mentioned at a few of the events we've held. So I think it's good to see Akivo back up and running and pushing and lobbying in a strong and forceful way that we possibly could do with right across some of our national voluntary sector organisations. And I know it's been hectic for all of our nationals, but we really do need to make the case for what the future looks like for our sector and play our part in the Northwest alongside those national partners. Right, I'll not hold up. going to introduce our first speaker, who's Ellie De Decker, who has 10 minutes. We'll try and keep to time. Ellie's the England Director at the National Lottery Community Fund, and she's going to give an overview of the lottery strategy for dealing with the medium and longer term challenges faced by the voluntary community, social enterprise sector, and plans to integrate learning from the rounds of COVID-19 emergency response funding into future funding processes. I've made the case nationally that the coordination of the voluntary sector's response has been largely down to and enabled by not only the groups that are out there using up reserves, but the way the lottery has supported that, particularly in the Northwest, in my mind. I'm hoping it's the same everywhere. And we've been pushing for the government to consider in wave 2 and tier 3 plus tier 4 areas, whatever we're going to call them, going beyond the 3rd of December, for that investment to be matched over the next 6 months from the government's own funding. And I've got some nationals on board for that as well. All right, so if I hand over to Ellie, and I'll stop talking now. I hope you enjoyed this conversation today.
Okay, so hello, I'm Ellie, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for having me. I sort of feel that I have to sort of step in big shoes by those speakers that were with you in the first couple of events, so I'll do my best. Before I sort of think about, before I start talking about where we want to go next, just maybe a little bit of an introduction to us and what we do. So we are the largest funder of community activity in the country, and thanks to National Lottery players, in England alone, we award over £450 million every year to about 10,000 organisations. So at any point in time, we have about 17,000 grant holders that we're working with. Now, we give grants, sort of small one-off grants of £300 all the way up to multi-million, multi-year grants. But over 80% of the grants that we award are below £10,000, so on the smaller end of the spectrum, and about 70 to 80% of our awards go to organisations with a turnover below £1 million. So we are really a funder of grassroots community activity. And our funding really reaches all over the country. So over the last 3 years, for instance, our funding reached in over 90% of all wards in the country. Every sort of local authority area we were funding in. Now, about 3 years ago, we moved to a regional structure because we wanted to make sure that we were closer to those communities we were trying to support. And we wanted to make sure that we had a deeper understanding of the context in which we were funding. And I think that served us well over the last 6 months. And my colleague Gillian Halliwell, who looks after our North region, is with us today. So if there's any particular questions with regards to our activity in the Northwest, she might be able to sort of respond. Now, we are not an emergency funder, so we tend to build on longer term relationships with organisations supporting communities. But obviously, when the pandemic hit, we wanted to respond. We really felt the need to respond. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to reassure those 17,000 grant holders that we would maintain our support, that we would be there for them, and that we would continue to be. And we also wanted to provide flexibility. So make sure that the organizations had the ability to adjust and to be able to respond to the situation that they were facing. So if that meant changing the focus of the work, that was fine. If that meant changing the timeline for delivery, that was fine. If that meant investing in their own digital capability, that was definitely something that we wanted to consider. We also were very clear that we wanted to reduce the admin burden and the reporting burden for organizations who were really working really hard in very, very difficult times. In terms of new funding, additional funding that we brought into the sector, our main aim obviously was to get money out into the sector as quickly as we could. And when then the government funding was announced, we wanted to make sure that we aligned our responses to keep it quite simple and straightforward for applicants, not to sort of have all these different pots floating about. So we wanted to make sure that we continue to fund smaller grassroots organizations. I think that this is in line with the way that we sort of normally work, but I think the sector really highlighted again how small grassroots organizations were often best placed to get support in communities to people really, really quickly. And I was very pleased to see how we were able to make sure that grassroots organizations really did access the sort of funding at hand. We also wanted to make sure that funding reached those communities most impacted by the crisis. I think, Alison, you mentioned it, that the crisis really demonstrated again how certain communities were really disproportionately affected. And we just wanted to make sure that smaller grassroots organizations specifically supporting those communities most impacted, and also organizations led by people who were most impacted could access funding. Infrastructure organizations, I think you'll be pleased to hear that for us, it was very clear as a result of the pandemic and in the context of the crisis, how valuable infrastructure organizations really were to support those grassroots organizations as well. And we've been working with national infrastructure organizations, but we also wanted to make sure that we could reach sort of local infrastructure organizations who potentially had closer links with those grassroots organizations. And then finally, again, building on a point that I believe Alison made, I think that the crisis seemed to have created a real impetus for organizations to work more closely together. And partnership working at the National Lottery Community Fund is something that we've been supporting now explicitly for some time. But I think the crisis really pushed for more partnership working, and we thought that that was very positive, actually. And it also pushed us as a funder to look more actively at how we worked with other funders as well. And we specifically channeled some of our funding through other funders to be able to get more money more quickly into the sector, specifically where we knew that our reach potentially wasn't as good as some other funders' reach could be. So what does that mean going forward? So we are coming to an end of our emergency funding. It's a bit weird to sort of say, are we coming to the end of an emergency? But we are now sort of really actively thinking to move back to our core funding. We need to recognize that the pandemic is still very much with us, of course. And we want to absolutely build on what we've learned over the last few months and what we've heard from our grant holders, from stakeholders in the sector. Now, we realize that many organizations will continue to struggle financially in the next few months, years. So we will need to make some tough decisions. But where we're at the moment is that we definitely want to continue to support those communities most affected by COVID. We know that certain communities have been underrepresented in our funding, we know that. And also we have heard that certain communities don't think that the lottery funding is for them. So we want to absolutely continue to reach out, make sure that our funding is as accessible as possible so that it can really go to those communities as well. We want to fund organizations to continue to deliver activity, but also we want to support organizations to think about themselves and their own development, and to make sure that organizations have the capacity and the capability to take a step back and think what the new normal might look like. So we want to make sure that our funding is flexible. We can support organizations for up to 5 years, but we can also give some shorter term funding if that's what organizations need. As I said, we want to support organizations to continue to deliver activity, but if they need to invest in themselves, that's definitely a conversation that we can have as well. We also want to continue to be flexible in our grant management. God knows what's going to happen next week, let alone 6 months from now, a year from now. So we need to be able to have that dialogue with the organizations that we support to make sure that they are in the best position to do what they need to do, whatever the situation at hand is. We want to make sure that we continue to look at the full ecology of the sector. So I've sort of already highlighted that obviously, naturally, we tend to sort of channel quite a bit of our funding to small grassroots organizations, but we know that there's value in supporting larger organizations as well, who can then in turn support the smaller grassroots organizations. We spoke about direct delivery, but also about infrastructure organizations. And we spoke about charities, but also social enterprises and community businesses. So for us, it's really important that we look at the sector as a whole and that we use our understanding of the local context to understand how we can support the ecology of the sector as a whole. Partnerships for us will continue to be a very big theme. We want to support organizations to continue to work together. We understand that that might require investment. You need capacity, you need time to build relationships with others. And that is definitely something that we're keen to support the sector on. But we also want to be challenged ourselves, and we want to continue to work in partnership with other funders. So partnership, across the board is something that will continue to be a very big theme for us. Now, we don't know what is going to happen next week. Uncertainty, I think, is going to be with us for some time. So we want to continue to listen. We want to continue to have conversations. We want to continue to learn. And forums like this is very, very good for us to be present at. And we will need to make sure that we will continue to be agile so that our funding can be as useful and relevant as possible to the sector in what will continue to be very challenging and uncertain times. I think I'll leave it at that for now, but very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ali. We're going to hear from Paul Streets, and then we'll come back to you with a Q&A session. So thank you very much for that, Ali, and for all the support you've shown to the sector as the lottery. I think one of our big worries was whether there'd be any investment left for the whatever the new normal looks like going forward for the wider voluntary sector after the crisis, should that ever occur. We can come back to this in the Q&A though. I'll introduce Paul Streets from the Chief Executive of the Lloyds Bank Foundation. He's going to give an overview of their strategy for dealing with the medium and longer term challenges faced by the sector and of how they plan to integrate learning from their rounds of COVID-19 emergency response funding going forward. I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Warren. Pleasure to be here. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, you got the slides. I got a few slides for you, which I'll share, and happy to take questions at the end. It's a really pleasure to be here. So, shame I'm not with you in Northwest. I wish I was talking to you over coffee and all the rest of it. It'd be far more interesting over a Zoom call, but there we go. That's life. So, firstly, us. That's us who those of you who don't know us. So, I've got a slide on Northwest specifically in a moment. But we do three things. We are the largest corporate funder spending money only in England and Wales, which is a bit of an indictment of corporate Britain, actually. We're not smaller than Lottery, but we are a big funder. But our focus is on sub 1 million charities. So primarily it's organisations in this sort of area, 200 to 400, 500,000, that sort of scope. We do go up to 1 million, but we don't go lower than 50,000. So we're not grassroots, so lottery funding, that's our focus. And we see our role as threefold. Most of the money goes out the door to fund, but we also increasingly do a lot of work around capacity building. We've developed quite a program called Enhance, which has a wide range of development support, which actually has come of age at the present. And we use a lot of what we learned to influence the wider environment policy on issues that we think we know about through working with people like you. So if I flip over, I hope, yeah, whoops, too far. And that's us in the Northwest. So commitment about 45 million at the moment across the UK, across England and Wales rather. Fund just under 100 charities in the Northwest, 6.5 million. The biggest areas are mental health, homelessness and domestic abuse, because that reflects our pattern overall. But I shall see there's an asylum seeker charity, Asylum Link in Merseyside as a case study on the right there. I thought I'd share with you some of the data. I don't know if you're aware of it. I put it on the chat. There's a really helpful COVID voluntary sector barometer being pulled together by NCVO and Sheffield University. And this is some extracts from that data. Now you can filter that out by region, and I'll look at some of the data by region. But it's updated every couple of weeks. It's really useful. This is the data from a couple of weeks ago. And it's talking about the financial position, obviously, what's deteriorated, what's got the same, range of services. Rather than focus on the national stuff, and I've put the link in for those who are interested, it is worth looking at, and it's a really good resource to filter through. I look at the Northwest specifically. So Northwest specifically, they've looked at 700 charities or so across England and Wales, of which 84 in the Northwest, and that's the split, so that's a fairly good range of issues and sizes. And if you look at what's affecting those charities like you, I mean, hopefully you recognise this because some of you may have responded to it. The big issues I think are interesting, unsurprisingly, the financial position has deteriorated. I think it's really interesting, this thing about some people have increased their range of services, but a number of them have decreased. And I think we have to ask about why, because in most cases we've seen demand rise significantly, as that next bar shows, a 57% increase in demand. And then you see that not many of you at the moment are likely to close, but we think the big hit will be next year, not this year, as we move forward. So if you look at us, this was really, we've looked at pulling together what we've learned from those of you we fund. And this is a story we think as of last week. I was talking to my policy team. So essentially, we think people have done a brilliant job on meeting the moment, switching to emergency relief, switching to digital online, incredibly impressive. A lot of people adopting housing and homelessness services to make them safe and allowing people to access them. A lot of old clients who have left the charities coming back to them because they need support. Big concerns now about a loss of group work and face-to-face work. We're really concerned that commissioners will think you've all embraced online. That's now the answer to everything because it's cheap as chips. But actually, it's not right for everybody. Some people don't want online. They need face-to-face. They need peer support. You know that. And big issues with access, particularly to prisons, mental health units, anybody using secure accommodation. And we're working with charities that have no access to prisons at all. And that's a real issue in terms of people coming out. Importantly, and I may touch on this a little bit later, we're seeing a lot of local flex. By that, I mean the best local authorities appear to be much more flexible in the way we're working with charities, which we've encouraged, and we think there appears to be, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this, a better recognition of local small organisations than there would have been if we were talking about this at the beginning of the year, which is a positive thing. And at this stage, we've seen very few closures. We think that will change next year, but at this stage, we haven't seen the kind of cataclysmic drops. In fact, the biggest hit has been to larger charities, national charities, in terms of income at this stage in the game, as far as we see it. We have some if you look ahead, we have some great concerns for the future, the mental health of leaders. We see leaders under massive stress, leaders who have used all their energy to support frontline workers dealing with massive demand and increasing complexity demand and not considering their own mental health. I keep talking to groups of charity leaders and say, for God's sake, take some leave. We all need to be taking some leave because this is going to be a long haul. Concern about suitability premises, what happens when we do go back to meeting people and actually do they queue outside in the cold? We've got to maintain social distance. Big concerns I think about those groups that do need face-to-face, and that is counterintuitive for me. We're finding some of the organisations that reach older people have gone online the best and easiest. Some of the organisations that reach people who are younger have really struggled, and young people seem to want face-to-face and peer-to-peer support from what we've learned. A concern that I'm sure many of you would echo, a big focus on short-term funding from us and from others and the lottery. What the hell happens longer term? Because people need to be putting in applications now for the money that will materialise to fund their work in 2021. If they can't do that, what happens about that 6-month funding gap? And funders having to flex what they do, and we're hoping most funders will do this. I mean, we have done quite a lot to flex what we've asked for charities that we fund, but not all funders are. So concerned for that. I went to an interesting session with Helen Stevenson, who's Chief Executive of the Charity Commission recently, and she was talking about, interestingly, an increase in the number of issues between senior teams and governing bodies. Things that were cracks prior to COVID are becoming chasms now, and I think that's something we need to be aware of. And of course, the economic impacts of COVID. So if I move on, our response to date, well, the first thing we did was increase flexibility. We've enabled people to say, actually, there are things that you were funded for that you may not need to do now because they're not relevant. Do that. We launched a new program which we will award next month, and I would hope we fund a number of organisations in the Northwest that fit this bill, which we've called a COVID recovery program. Might be premature, but we're committed that 25% of that will be given to organisations that are Black, Asian, or minority-led, particularly relevant in the Northwest, where you have quite a lot of organisations that are Black, Asian, and minority-led. We will do more work around development. We're seeing a big increase in demand for development support. Part of the program that I mentioned was development partner approach. As I noticed earlier, we do a lot of what we call enhance. We try to systematize that with people who work alongside charities with what we think will be a significant period of transition, both in how they provide services and how they raise income over the course of the next 12 months. And we're working with 6 communities, one of which is Halton. It's nice to have Sally Yeoman on the call to think about how we support communities more grassroots up and more based on preventative work, I suspect, is the way that will pan out. And we've done quite a lot of support influencing work, trying to raise the profile of charities and their response to COVID, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. And increasingly, we found that people really want the opportunity to network with each other. I'm sure events like this have been really valuable, Warren. Now, some really important things to do. People want that support from peers, from what we found. So if we look forward, for charities, we think business and service models will continue to be really challenged, though for obvious reasons. How organisations adapt in the next couple of years is going to be critical. Will they survive at all? I suspect many will, but will limp on. We know that voluntary sector organisations tend to have a kind of roller coaster income and expenditure, especially small local ones, and that may well just continue. But will many survive? I suspect many will, but it's going to be a struggle. And there may be opportunities to build from this in terms of local reputation. I won't talk about the wider society stuff in great detail. It's things you already know. Real concern about the impact on marginalised communities, whether that's frankly traveller communities or whether it's a Black, Asian, minority ethnic led, poorer places. what we call a K-shaped recovery, and I'll talk about it in a moment. I mean, people have started talking about a K-shaped recovery, and what we're seeing is an increase in inequality both within communities but within regions. Actually, the south and the southeast getting more prosperous, and places like the northwest, the northeast, North Wales are actually levelling down, if anything, with a K-shaped recovery. Some getting richer, others not. And a real concern, but it is an opportunity that government doesn't have the bandwidth to engage with this. It doesn't have solutions. It doesn't have the bandwidth. There are some opportunities there, but with Brexit going on, all the stuff around COVID, government isn't really focusing on what the medium-term impacts of COVID will be on local economies. I'm sure Neil will talk about that later on, and he's talking to you, he's strong on that. So I painted you two scenarios which might provoke a bit of conversation here. You may or may not like them, but my first is gloom and bloom. This is me as optimistic. Frankly, it's pretty crap, the outline for the next 12 months. But the bloom of that is actually, maybe there's an e-nirvana coming about that. Maybe people will perceive that charities have really responded amazingly, and local government and local people will support them much better than they have. We've seen glimmers of that in some places. Maybe charities will embed some of those changes with these mixed models that have happened during COVID, which are good things. You know, maybe government will really get. I mean, Rishi Sunak for the first time talked about small charities. I've never heard anybody in number 10 and number 11 talk about small local charities in the way that he did when he announced his 750 million, and most of the 750 million has gone to small local organisations, much to the chagrin of large charities, which have got virtually nothing from government. So maybe there is a kind of new nirvana once we've got over the next 12 months. The doom for me is that it isn't a new nirvana. That demand and need will grow even more. Charities will go back to always, when actually we have learned different ways to operate, and I think that mix of way in which we provide services, actually online has improved access to some people, and particularly vulnerable people, and we need to recognise that. That government and local government just don't really get this at all. A massive shakeout in the sector, inequalities exactly the same as on the left, but worse. And this K-shaped recovery, and I think pretty critical to this, and I would really criticise us as a sector for our positioning overall on this, is we've got to influence the macroeconomic arguments and there's side trend in economics. And one of the big questions, if you look back, been reading back at what happened in the Depression in the 20s and 30s, and what happened was Milton Keynes came along and forwarded a new type of economics, which was welcomed by others, and actually became the new way in which the public sector was funded. In the past, it was all a bit about financial control. So is Rishi Sunak Keynes, or is he Milton Friedman? Are we going back to Thatcher and austerity? That'll be a question, I think, for us as we move forward. So some things to leave you with before we go into the discussion. A very personal perspective. I've been utterly astonished and amazed and surprised, but shouldn't have been, by how fantastically small charities generally have pivoted. Really concerned about leaders, really concerned about chief execs. They seem upbeat at the moment, but they're exhausted and they're not thinking enough about themselves. They're thinking too much about the people they're trying to serve, which I understand. Digital's fine, but comes with a lot of caveats of people who can't reach it and can't access it. Ditto short-term income. Seems to be plenty of money around at the moment. What happens in 12 months' time? I'm concerned in the middle there that our messaging as a sector has been too much about givers, givers, givers. Look at the impact on us. And not enough about the people and the issues we're here for and the impact on them. And I think unless we focus on the issues and the places and the people that are affected by the crisis, particularly the economic crisis here, I'd say, we will lose the plot and we will lose public sympathy. It's simply about give us more money. Question about, is this sort of shakeout a helpful thing? You know, will this sort the weak from the chaff? Well, in some respects it will. We will see, frankly, some of the weaker organisations that probably should have folded anyway, folding because of COVID. My concern is that that won't necessarily follow where the need is. And actually some of the organisations that fold will be those with the greatest need, focusing on the communities with the greatest need, in the places with the greatest need. So significant collateral damage. So Warren Nelson, I'm going to hand over to you. I think that, how was it? Oh yeah, how should you respond? I was going to talk about that, was I? Yeah, okay. This is how I think we're responding, and this might be helpful to you. It's a long haul. You talked about strategy. I think strategy frameworks need to be frameworks, not straitjackets. Don't tie yourselves down too much. Agile, agile, agile. We're doing that. Got to think about new service models. Are they working? I mean, yes, of course, embrace online, but ask what does that mean for people who are vulnerable? Looking at different income models. Again, we can support on that to some degree. And then engaging on those macroeconomic issues about, you know, how will this shape public spending, in particular, given where you are. We've got to play that bunch of 50 Tories or 80 Tories who are over the red wall absolutely ruthlessly, I think, in the next 2-3 years. We have to make them become the pressure group within government and parliament that will actually begin to shift the debate. You know, Boris Johnson will never get his levelling up the way things are happening. So I think as as an entity, and people like VSNW will be really critical in this, and your equivalents in the Northeast, in playing that red wall card absolutely relentlessly about government focusing on this as a major aspect of the agenda over the next 2-3 years, because frankly, otherwise Boris Johnson has no chance of winning the next election. So I'll leave that with you, Warren, and I'll try and stop sharing screen.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful from both of you. Thank you very much. There's been some questions answered. I think the thing I was reminded of there with the big red wall was a recent conversation in Liverpool City region where we were thinking, have we got any connections to Conservative MPs that we can make the case for need and communities and what needs to happen? And the conversation ended with, we think there's one in Southport, but which wasn't greatly useful, but it is proven really part of the conversations across the rest of the Northwest where those relationships to the Conservative Party have paid dividend where they can be used effectively. Right, so rather than me doing it, if anybody wants to ask a question, stick your hand up. I'm going to pick on Dave first because he's been asking around a theme that's come through the chat around partnership around funders.
Yeah, I mean, I've posted it obviously on the chat already. From my perspective, I think the way funders have worked together and collaborated and communicated, and the messaging that came out very early on the Londoners Funders Agreement was fantastic. And I know a number of charities use that as an encouragement, leverage, or whatever terminology you want to use. I suppose my question is, how much is that to continue? What's the commitment to continue? And that we don't lose the collaboration and the way we've learned over the last 6 months when we get back into everybody fighting for everybody again.
You want to come in, Ellie, and then we'll pass that across the board.
Sure. I think for us, the way that we've been able to work with other funders has been a real positive over the last 6 months. It's to sort of go back to Paul, so that you can take the doom and the gloom, but you can try to find the positive through challenges, right? And I would say that the way that we have been as funders able to sort of work together, and also from a National Lottery community perspective, how that has helped us to do what we wanted to do, I think is definitely been a very an absolute positive. So we are definitely keen to build on that and looking to continue conversations with the partners that we've been working with, but also with others, and to see how we can how we can continue to do that. And that might take the shape of continued formal partnerships, or it might at least make sure that we sort of continue to have that alignment. So there's different shapes and forms that those partnerships can take. But I think it's been an absolute positive, and I'd be very keen to continue to build on that. And not, and in London there's been a lot, but also more locally in the other regions.
It was really important for us. We used that to initiate a conversation with public sector commissioners who issued statements in the Northwest. So we really appreciate that.
And I think there is a real sort of, for me, there's a really interesting question in terms of the London funders model, which obviously works in London, but, what about sort of a Manchester funders, or, so I think what can we do to stimulate some of those models to be implemented in other areas as well?
Thank you, Ellie. Paul, I've seen you've stuck some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, there's all of the conversation going on in the chat in there. But anyway, on that specifically, Warren, I put in a link to the ACF Collaborative Hub. A number of us, I mean, we funded it. Actually, Lottery have been reporting this as well. 2 or 3 of us have funded this to kick it off. And it's building on the London Funders. I mean, London Funders initiative was great. I don't think it will be as easy as that. I think London Funders focused on relatively short-term funding and a very discrete geography with a very well-organised group of funders who, and their ability to get short-term small amounts of money out has been fantastic. I suspect that funders won't do that with major investments, but I do think there'll be more collaboration. And we created through ACF, the ACF Collaborative Hub, as a means to do that. And there's an opportunity here for VSN Northwest and others to come together and actually use the hub to think about people who want to focus on your region. I know that there are some regional versions of that too, so worth looking at that hub, Warren, and seeing if that could be relevant to you and using it. I mean, it shouldn't just be a flat resource with information on collaboration. It should actually enable people to collaborate around issue or place. So I would hope it's of some use.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Does anybody want to ask a question? I don't want to take this over, but if you want to raise a hand or wave a hand at me and interject, that would be really useful if you've got a question. I've got lots, but if you want to ask. shout out if you're raising your hand. Hanif, go on. You're on mute, Hanif.
To unmute. Hi. Question for Ellie. I know it's difficult. Can you define what the small charity sector is, or turnover for them to be classified as small?
Yeah, so we just sort of used the NCVO classifications to sort of guide us. So as I said, 80% of the awards that we make go to organizations with a turnover below 1 million. Now, that sort of is micro, small, and medium sized. So we just sort of use the NCVO definition. I think small is sort of below 500,000 as per the sort of NCVO. But one of the sort of things that we have been very pleased about over the last 6 months is that we've really tried to sort of look at the smaller end of the sector, and a lot of the sort of newer grant holders that we've been able to reach has been on the smaller end. So we're really actively trying to reach smaller organizations and make sure that our funding is also accessible to them.
Just a supplementary one, if I may. Lots of funding, lots of investment or funding has gone for short-term COVID pandemic situation grants. I'm aware of half a dozen in the Northwest who applied, who got it, but 80% of them actually will close down, will go bankrupt in 6 months. So don't you feel that a lot of funders have invested a lot of money, which has gone down the, what's the expression in English, down the tube, or, you know, in 6 months they're gonna be out of business, and you've put a lot of money in. So, I mean, that's my observation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting challenge. And again, we've obviously had lots of discussions about this, right, when we were trying to, again, to sort of get that support to organizations out there. And again, specifically organizations who we felt were in a good position to sort of provide that support to communities in crisis. And we really tried to sort of also understand where the organization was at, just to avoid exactly what you were saying, that we would fund an organization that was fundamentally not really viable. But again, what we was really trying to do was to sort of keep support to communities going. And what we're now trying to do is look at the pipeline overall, look at who we have supported, and then try to sort of see what support we can continue to provide. Now, it would be foolish for me to pretend that we're going to be able to keep the sector as a whole afloat. We all know that that is not true. So, but what we're obviously trying to do is, again, in the local context, try to understand which organizations we have supported, and then try to decide how we can continue to support the sector most effectively. I agree with you. Some of the sector will look different in a few months' time, but I think what we're trying to do, what we have tried to do, is just to keep, as best as we could, support for communities going through this crisis.
Thank you, Ellie. If I get a last question from Alex, who's had his hand up a long time. I'm missing you out, Mark. Sorry.
Guess what Mark was going to say, shall I? No, it's just I put a question to Paul, which he's answered to me privately, and then we've kind of gone on a little bit, but might be worth just bringing that out a bit. So, talking about influencing the economic model overall, and I think that's a really key point, actually. Tactically, in the short term, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that you can do anything with the red wall or anything. But I think the problem we've got is that we will never have the kind of status and the kind of resources that we need within our sector in England until we see a rethinking of the national economic model. And bizarrely enough, I don't know whether Brexit will actually open up things in such a way that that might take place. I'm quite interested in whether Paul or Ellie, for that matter, just thinking a little bit further ahead, 5 or 6 years from now, whether you think we will be in a position to influence.
I think it's the best chance we have with the red wall. I mean, it's the first time we've had a Tory majority with a significant number of MPs who are north of that wall. So I think we've got to really grasp that and help them get organised. They need ammunition. They need ammunition to make the case. And too often as a sector, we moan about how poor we are and not enough about the broader economic. Neil will talk about this, I'm sure. but we need to be much smarter in terms of the way we articulate the economic arguments for the North. And I think, I mean, Hannah, your question is interesting because my attention, I'm going to link the two together if I may, because I think the people you ought to be lobbying are not necessarily funders, because I think funders will turn on the taps again. Most funders, for me, look like they put in new short-term funding for this year and will go back to long-term funding next year. There'll be a cash flow gap. I get that. But the big funders I'm talking to who are endowed actually have done very well. They're at the other end of the K, so they've done really well. So it's not funders, it's local authorities and central government. I think if organisations like VS Northwest and VON in the Northeast cannot make the case for investment in the North, then I think we're screwed, frankly. And I think you guys have to make it. You've got the ammunition there. You have to make it in a way that speaks Tory. We've all got to start speaking Tory. We too often think of ourselves and are perceived as a bunch of lefties. That's the way the sector is generally perceived, a bunch of lefties who actually don't talk the way this government wants to talk. And we have to get our heads in what makes this government tick and help them think through. They have no solutions. We've got a Prime Minister who's absolutely committed to levelling up, or so he says. And what he's seen through COVID is exactly the reverse happening. They are devoid of answers. And I think it's incumbent on us, and I would say organisations like VS Northwest and VON, you should be coming together with people like VON and the community foundations, the other CVSs, of which you have a number of really good CVSs in the Northwest, to make those arguments, not just shouting at the government, try to show it a different way to invest in the kind of social infrastructure we need to. Otherwise, all you get is another bloody great big HS2, and none of us want that, frankly. HS2 is not the answer, is it? It's about investment in social infrastructure. And I think we have to be making those arguments in a compelling way, and we are not doing that as a sector.
I think that's the key for conversation going forward. The problem with all of this is landed at the time when European funding is going to end. Councils are falling over and asking if they can escape their obligation to balance their books at the end of the year. And we think we're unclear of the way the health and social care, the health system, the NHS system is going to operate going forward, if it's going to remain top-down command and control, and the kind of local conversations that we've had in parts of the Northwest in terms of that devolved conversation may come to a bit of an abrupt end going forward. What we're clear is there will be a desperate attempt to kind of finance an economic investment across the country, and we need to make the case for that to be an inclusive economic investment would be my case. But I think this moves us on nicely and thank you to Paul, thank you to Ellie, that's really appreciated, and your thinking on the way forward has been fantastic, and your investment in keeping the show on the road, as it were, has been amazing. So thank you very much to both of you. I know we're running over, so I do apologise, but I think that was really useful, and I think we could have spent another 40 minutes on that conversation, but we've got other speakers. We've overbooked as usual, so I'm sorry. There's too many special people in the world, isn't there? If that can be the message from our AGM and today's Festival of Northwest Thinking, I think that's what we're trying to make the most of at the moment in the Northwest. Right, so we've got the next session, which is with the think tanks. We've got two amazing speakers. We've got Sarah Longlands, who's the director of IPPR North, and we've got Neil McEnroy, who I saw on Twitter is beginning possibly one of the longest goodbyes in his new role that I've ever seen. It might be even longer than Boris Johnson's, but we'll see where we get to. Right, so Sarah is director of IPPR North. She's going to give an overview of her vision for COVID-19 recovery and the role she sees for the sector in this, and the kinds of policies and approaches that IPPR North are advocating for. So when Paul says we need to make the case for the North, I think Sarah and Neil and their organisations are the jewels in how we make that case, and they will be a key part of this, whether they like it or not. But if I hand over to Sarah.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation to come along this afternoon, and for those that really warm introduction, Warren. And I have to say that it's really great to be on the same platform as Neil as well. Neil's been a long-term friend and colleague, and it's really nice to share some space together again and debate some of these issues with him and all of you who have come along to this afternoon's session. For those of you who don't know IPPR North, we are a dedicated think tank for the North of England. We were set up 16 years ago in recognition of the fact that the policy-making debate is very centralised in the UK. Most of the decisions about our lives are made in Westminster, and often it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And IPPR North was an attempt to try and rail against that, to provide a different perspective, which said more about the realities of life in areas like the North, and was able to channel that back to Westminster, but also to start moving the discussion politically to the North of England as well. And what I want to say today draws on the work we've been doing, thinking about the economic model in the North of England and in the UK more generally, but also the work we've done on a very long-term study that we've been involved with since 2008, which has been known as the Third Sector Trends Survey. And that's been one of the biggest pieces of research, which has given us a kind of long-term barometer, if you like, insight into how voluntary and community organisations are doing across the North of England. And I just want to draw a little bit on that at the start, because I mean, I find it really difficult talking about COVID-19 and what will happen beyond COVID-19, because at the minute, you know, I don't know what it's like for the rest of you, but sometimes it's difficult just to see to the end of the week at the minute. I think it's important to recognise that this is a really exceptional situation for us. I mean, I think Alison mentioned at the start that it was, you know, it's equivalent to the Second World War, and certainly it is momentous in terms of our lifetimes. And we will talk about pre and post COVID, I think, in years to come. What we can be certain about is that it will be over at some point. But the reality that we come back to will probably be very different in many ways to the sort of normal that we left at the end of February and the beginning of March. But so I think the first thing I wanted to do was to think about what the sector was pre-COVID. And I think what we can absolutely say is that the voluntary and community sector in the North of England is a really strong, vibrant force. And we know from the work that we have done that our estimates from the Northern Survey that we have at least 42,000 voluntary and community organisations operating in the North of England, and almost half of those are based in the Northwest. We know that they are a vital part of the economy, employing 240,000 employees, again, half of which are in the Northwest. They have nearly 1 million volunteers, producing 64 million hours of volunteer time. So the voluntary community sector pre-COVID was an integral part of our economy, an integral part of our community. It's the foundation often of the places in which we live, and it's often part of who we are, our actual identity in our communities, in our towns, in our cities, in our rural areas, and also I think in the North. And the North has a very long and proud history of activism and contributions, not only in the North and nationally, but internationally across the world. We've had a major influence in terms of our activism and our community and voluntary spirit. So that's where we were before COVID. And when we start to think about what might be the implications of COVID for the sector beyond, some of the work that we've done recently, we published a report in June, in September, which drew on the survey results from the last recession. And we were attempting to try and understand, what does the last recession tell us about the sector's resilience and adaptability? And when we look at those results, it tells us that actually the voluntary and community sector has often been much stronger and more resilient than is often given credit for. And I think there's a popular misconception in the media that community organisations and charities that rely particularly on volunteers are unstable, are weak, and perhaps are on the brink of collapse at any moment. But actually what we see in the results is that they show a huge amount of resilience under pressure, that they're often hugely adaptable and pragmatic, and in a crisis they batten down the hatches and they get on with it because they're used to dealing with the crises of other people's lives. They understand crises and collapse, and they know how to deal with it. And one of the other reasons for that resilience is the fact there's a low churn within charity organisations, and they tend to be much older than, say, their private sector equivalent. So if you look at the average age of the voluntary organisations in our survey, it's about 31 years old, and that's equivalent to the average age of a private business in the economy. It's about 8.5 years old. So there's a real kind of resilience there, and we're in it for the long term kind of mentality. But what the thing that we do see that perhaps are the areas for concern post-COVID are the fact that the sector is built on its volunteers. And obviously social distancing, the risk of infection, the fact that many volunteer organisations rely on older people mean that there is a challenge there going forward, and how the volunteering capacity can remain healthy and well in the first place, but also can remain active within the sector during and after COVID as well. And the other issue is that in our work, we've repeatedly found that voluntary and community organisations in the areas of high deprivation are much more vulnerable financially than in other areas. And I expect, given the profile of COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact that it is having in areas of deprivation, that we would see that trend continued. So those, I guess, are some of the real challenges ahead. So we've looked at the sector before, we've looked at the sector potentially and what the impacts might be after. Where does policy fit into this, and what will the policy be beyond COVID? Well, we've heard a huge amount of rhetoric from this government, both before and during COVID so far. We've heard about levelling up. We've seen a big report from Danny Kruger on that subject. We've heard a lot about the need to repair our social fabric from organisations like Onward, which is a really leading Tory think tank, a big driver behind the kind of levelling up debate. We've also seen this sort of terminology around Build Back Better, which has been used both regionally in the Northwest, but also nationally, and sort of being taken up in Boris Johnson's campaign. And we've also heard, as we heard in Paul's presentation, about the kind of the red wall. I myself am not a fan of the red wall discourse. I don't like the imagery of walls. And I think that, you know, the challenge of, for me, in my mind, we need to stop talking about walls and start talking about some of the kind of things that kind of unite us, that bring us together. And I think my other challenge with the red wall is that it's often used synonymously with the North, and actually a lot of those seats that went blue at the last election were in many other parts of the UK as well. So I think we have to be a bit cautious with red wall. But I think it is certainly important to think about what the government and what the Tories are looking at in terms of this agenda, and to think critically about it. And when we start to think critically, I think the first problem I have is that the tone is often a bit of a false optimism, a kind of an oversimplification sometimes of the complexity. We know from our research, and our research at IPPR North is very, very focused on the stubborn nature of inequality, particularly within and between regions of the UK, and particularly specifically England, actually. England is our kind of real area of interest. Although obviously I'm interested in beyond that, coming from Northern Ireland. But that's the first thing, that the tone often can ring a little hollow, given what we know in the sector about the stubborn nature of inequality. And that's on any metric that you want to look at: health, income, jobs. The North comes out worse in almost all of those metrics. But as Paul mentioned as well, we also have huge potential. We at IPPR North have talked a lot about that in terms of the fact that the North has a huge amount of economic and community vibrancy, and often not being given the oxygen in terms of investment and powers to actually make that work. So that's the first thing, that tone, I think, oversimplifies the complexity. The second thing is that a lot of the policy rhetoric at the minute overlooks the impact of austerity, which we think has been very significant, and I think particularly for the organisations that many of you work for. The third is that there's often an implicit reliance upon philanthropy and goodwill, and I think, you know, okay, it's an important part of the mix, but it will only get you so far. The government is not just an enabler, as it's often portrayed, but it is also a direct financial contributor to the voluntary and community sector. That's both in terms of grants, but also in terms of the commissioning landscape as well. And I think you can't ignore that. You can't pretend that is not going to be part of the future for the sector. If we're simply relying on the private sector, then that means there's serious questions about what happens in an economic crisis when some of that money starts to dry up. Fourthly, the emphasis is often on big ideas driven by a central state. When we see this in the Danny Kruger paper, it's a paper written for Boris Johnson in a similar kind of way that we saw with Big Society. And I think we're always sort of searching for this panacea, this sort of centralized answer that will address the concerns that politicians may have about a voluntary community sector, for example, or that we ourselves might think are some of the challenges that we think may be important. And I think the problem with that is that there's not enough trust in the place itself, in places, and there's not enough recognition that a one-size-fits-all will not work. and that we need to, at a fundamental level, we need to have greater trust and greater respect for the ideas and capacity of places at a local level. And the answer to this isn't necessarily more devolution, which is what we often say at IPPR North, that the answer to everything is devolution. Devolution's, part of the wider debate at the minute. The answer, I think, is just about a recognition that there is life beyond Westminster, that people do have ideas and people do have expertise that needs to be recognised in a much more holistic way going forward. And I think the other part of the answer is about the way that our democracy works, that we need much greater deliberation, much greater participation actively in the decision-making environment within our localities. And that might be around sort of greater use of things like community assemblies and citizens' juries, but I think it's just more of a greater listening, if you like, to organisations and to communities and to what they have to say and drawing upon their expertise, rather than assuming that the centre or a local government or a combined authority knows best. And then finally, there's a need to continually question the economic model that we have in the UK. And we've seen this in the North. A lot of the debate on Northern Powerhouse, on levelling up, it's always about productivity at its heart, that if we can just create more productivity, if we can close the productivity gap, then that will give us enough headroom, enough excess income to be able to then start funding the things that we think are important, like education and health and the voluntary and community sector. And no, that's the wrong way around. What we need to do is start investing in people and in the communities where they live. And actually, by supporting people to have a better life, to have a decent education, to live in decent housing, then that in itself will start to generate benefits for our economy from the places upwards. And I think that's the way that we need to start thinking about it, rather than this really top-heavy emphasis on productivity all the time. So that kind of takes me to the end of what I wanted to say. There's a number of recommendations in our report too, which I can post a link up on the chat box if you want to have a look at that. But that really emphasises the importance of the communication within the sector and the need for that future investment. So thanks very much, and happy to take further questions.
Thank you, Sarah. We're just running a bit behind, and I just want to make sure we get to our next two speakers, then we'll come back to questions after that. I'll waste no more time. I hope everybody knows Neil McEnroy, the Chief Exec of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and I'll hand over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Warren. Delighted to be here this afternoon, and I'm Neil. I'm from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, a national organisation for local economies, and it's delighted to be engaged with VS&W. It's been a while, so thanks for the invite, Alison and Warren. And also, it's lovely to be on that platform here with Sarah, my old friend. Let's just talk a little bit about this crisis. I've heard a few things that's been said. This crisis is not linear. And that, I mean, it's not in this crisis, middle, and then out of it, and back to some kind of old normal. And we're hearing a lot of that rhetoric, Dominic narrative, we're in a crisis. Linear, we'll get out of it. This is not a linear crisis, it's a roller coaster loop with moments of intense hanging on, and then maybe it'll ease a bit. There'll be future pandemics, and we're in a climate crisis, and we've got greater inequalities than we've ever had. We're in a roller coaster loop, and we need to break out of that roller coaster loop, and we need a new economic and social model for that. So you need to disabuse yourself from any idea that we're in some kind of linear process, we'll get back to an old normal. No, we can't go back to the old normal because we've got a climate crisis, which needs a new economic model. And Alex in the chat is spot on. That's exactly what we need. And we need to get ahead of the game. And at the moment, what's happening is there's people around who will take us back to the old game. They're hanging on like grim death to the old economic model. They're hanging on to their power. They're hanging on to the last vestiges of what given their power and wealth. And they'll hang on till the end. So this is a deep, deep moment of societal change that's not seen for centuries. Massive. And so we need to wake up and break out of that roller coaster loop. Now, COVID, it's a stark reminder, isn't it, to how much the old economy's failed, and how it's failed us. Look at the inequalities like a couple of days ago. Look at that. Who's suffering the most? The poor, disadvantaged groups, And people like us in the Baltic, you've got to pick up it because we're not funding public services properly enough. Yeah, the poor are suffering, the poor are dying more. What a travesty, absolute travesty. It's revealed, this crisis, the importance of the everyday economy, of broadband, of food, of shelter and light. We need to own that more because the market's not doing it properly. It's revealed that well-being and health is intrinsically related to the economy. Wealth equals health. It's revealed the indispensability of essential workers like nurses, people in the community and voluntary sector, is more important than property developers to our society. It's revealed the resurgence of the local, the intimate, the care, the human touch, yeah? And how our consumption patterns are detached from the actual economy around us. It's revealed the folly of the agglomeration economics model, that people that have said, we'll get growth in our city centre and it will trickle outwards and trickle downwards. No, it's not. It's not trickled downwards and outwards. Our fundamental city-based economic development model has been failing us. And it's revealed the interconnectedness between us. We don't stand alone in this world. We are human social beings. The stakes are massive. Yeah. In April, we had internal discussions with good friends, including the Democracy Collaborative, a US think tank, and we painted three pictures: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly we never thought could happen. The ugly was a new authoritarianism with weakened democracy and accountability, a growth in corporate capitalism, spiv economics and cronyism. We spelt it out in April. My God, it's happening. The ugly is happening. We said there could be the bad, the old fossil capitalism, old economic development, with just a wee bit of added interventionism here and there. And then there was the good, a moment to build a new economic, social and environmental future for us all, a rise of devolution, Green New Deal, a new social contract where we as a sector play a role in it, community wealth building. Now, turning to community wealth building, it is the good. And people say, I'm now part-time seconded to the Scottish Government, yeah, rolling out community wealth building across Scotland. It's happening all across England. This is a new economic model that's happening piece by piece, chunk by chunk, fight by fight. Yeah, it's not toadying to the existing government in the UK. It's saying, you know what? You've got it all wrong. You're not focusing on well-being economics. You're not focused on inclusive economy. You're not focused on building the new justice we require. No, you're ignoring it. So in this time, there's very little truck. What is the point of talking and trying to work with these reactionary forces that are trying just to go back to the ugly or the bad? This is a moment of deep change. There's no, let's take, so finish here, I'll finish quickly. I've cut through some of what we talked about just for speed one. Just let's look here. We need a new social contract, and you and all of us need to be at the core of it. Let's look at this community power and this Kruger report. I spoke to Danny Kruger when he consulted lots of us. I told him three things. One, do not ignore systemic social and economic and ecological injustices. He did. He denies the fact that there is systemic injustices in our society. I told him, do not create some big society revivalism. It's what it is. And don't, please, give a big waffly report with some waffle about social contracts that doesn't really mean much. He did, the social covenant. The future here is not about you fitting in the gaps of a failing public service, of filling in the gaps of an economy going wrong. Our task now is to actually take more control of the economy. It's to grow what you do, to fight what you do, to deliver more care, to deliver more things in the foundation of an economy, to get involved more in retail, to start getting involved in manufacturing, to start getting involved in the actual ways that the economy functions. the inclusive economy agenda that Salford's up to is the kind of thing we should be doing. Community wealth building is what we should be doing. We need to get off our idea that we just fit in between the public sector and a little bit on the side. No, we are the new economy, and we need to get really active about that. Now, I know it might not be in your domain to think you should be activists, but I think you need to get activists. Who else is there? It's us and communities. We need to be activists now. We need to get on the streets. We need to get angry. It's only us. We need to look after our communities, and we need to fight political battles, and we need to fight to try and build this new world. Final two things is levelling up. If it wasn't so pathetic, if it wasn't so grave situation, it would be laughable. It would be ha ha ha. 100 years of bloody talk of rebalancing the economy. It goes right back to 1918, the Haldane Committee, the Barlow Commission. It's been there, it's catalogued, nothing's ever happened, nothing changes. Levelling up, ha ha ha. It's a joke, nothing but a joke. It's an electoral tool. Nothing's going to come of it. Nothing's going to come of it. And finally, the point about community activism. I don't know how you turn the dial on this, but I do know that in other administrations all across the world, the community sector is aligning itself with local politicians and local administrations to fight back. And I would say to you that your local authorities are democratic, or local authorities or politicians who've got the right idea of what we should be happening. They're your allies. Otherwise, this sector will end up filling in the spaces of a declining public sector, and you'll be handed lots of stuff with no enough money to deal with it. And we won't be building back better, and we won't be building a new economy that is inevitably required. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. I don't want to add to that. I think that was just amazing.
Yes.
Other than to know that Alex wants to he's going to get arrested on the back of this. We have been talking about bringing back some of the models of activism, and I think that needs to be part of our conversation, but that was really inspiring. Thank you to both our speakers, Sarah and Neil. We are running behind, so I'm going to ask Sanjeev Lingaya, I hope I've said that right, to talk, because I know he has to go for childcare reasons, so we'll do that. Neil and Sarah, are you okay hanging on a little bit for some questions? I understand if you'd have to rush off, we are running over. But if I introduce Sanjeev, so Sanjeev is from an independent, he's going to be looking at independent social impact research and facilitation consultation specialist in racial justice, and he's been working for Voice for Change England, and he's the lead author on Akivo's Home Truths report, which is concerned with undoing racism and delivering real diversity in the sector. I'll not go through the rest of the intro, I'm sorry to say, but if I hand over to Sanjeev, because I know you've got to rush off at this point soon.
Thank you, Warren. I've just thrown up some home truth stuff. Yeah, basically, my children are due to come back at 4:30, and they essentially are Zoom kryptonite. So that's why I have to rush off. So I do apologise. Just as I say, I put some home truth stuff up there. I don't know if people have seen the report. Just to say that I'm an independent researcher. I'm also an associate of Voice for Change England, and together with Akivo, we developed this work around the charity sector and racism, and so that's what I'm going to centre my comments on today. I do want to say thank you as well to my brilliant co-authors, Christiana Rickson and Maisie Hulbert from Akivo. Also thanks to Lottery, who funded the work. And I should also stress that I'm speaking here in an individual capacity, because sometimes I say things that are a bit naughty. So don't want to get anyone else in trouble, happy to get in trouble myself. So I think the way that this session was titled was along the lines of supporting and empowering the BAME-led voluntary and community sector. So I just want to kind of riff on that idea in a few ways, but also to kind of extend that to why has that sector been undermined and disempowered to date, which I think is one of the insights that we get from the Home Truths report. So I think I want to talk about, I think one of the things that we've made the mistake in the charity sector and the voluntary sector is to think that we are above society, not part of society. And I think one of the initial insights when I reached over to Akivo about a couple of years ago to think about what has now become the Home Truths work is to recognise how racism lives in society, and therefore racism lives in the charity and the voluntary sector, and how even though we have this self-image of being the good guys, we too have our problems to work through. I just want to talk briefly about some of the underlying, and one thing to say as well, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this work a couple of years ago was that there was a lot, there was, and to some extent still is, quite a lot about the diversity agenda. And one of the things that is very clear to me and what that I felt needed saying is the diversity problem in the charity and the voluntary sector is not a diversity problem, it's actually a race problem. And it's a problem to do with racism. And I think unless we can make that connection, we can't really make the kind of deep and irreversible change and movement that we need to. So I think that's just to give you a sense of that. And just to give you a quick story about a funder, not Lloyd's and not Lottery. So a good funder, a well-respected funder, asks a racialized an organization led by racialized and minoritized people to come up with an idea around civic engagement. Said organization comes up with an idea and the funder says, oh, that doesn't quite feel right for us. That same funder speaks to a larger mainstream white-led organization. They mention the same idea that the organisation led by racialised and minoritized people mentioned, and then the funder comes back to that first organisation and says, oh, you know that thing that you mentioned before? Yeah, we kind of think that's quite a good idea now, and we can fund that. And I guess what the thing I want to point at in the story is that is the kind of conversation that people who work in organisations led by Black and brown folk, racialised people experience all of the time. And I think that what that story illustrates is kind of notions of excellence and trust. So who can be considered excellent and who can be trusted? And I think it also points to this deep problem that we have, a kind of mental model that lives in all parts of our society, that whereby we tend to discount the excellence that exists in racialized and minoritized organizations and that lives in the heads of racialized and minoritized people. And I think I don't just want to pick on funders, because that problem, that underlying fundamental problem, doesn't just live with funders. It is reflected in the voluntary and community sector more generally, the charity sector more generally. I think we have to recognise that the mainstream voluntary sector has not been a hospitable place for racialised and minoritized people, and the sector has not been orientated to securing racial justice and attending to the particular needs of racialised and minoritized people. I'll say something a bit more hopeful in a while, but we had an online survey as part of Home Truths, and thanks to the nice people at Charity So White, it got a lot of spread, and we had over 500 responses. And of those 500, over half, I think it was around half, said these are racialized and minoritized people working in the charity sector, said that they have to tone down their behavior or be on their best behavior just to get by in the charity sector. And I think I know in one of the earlier talks, Fazana Khan talked about trauma, and I think we need to consider what if our sector is a site for harm and for trauma, and what are the implications of that, and what does that mean for what we need to do. I'll move briefly on to what is to be done. Obviously, a very difficult question. I just want to say two things on this. One is, I think we have to sit with our failure as a sector on issues of race and racism, and kind of sit in and with that uncomfortable idea. James Baldwin, who's just a genius, says not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that is absolutely true. And I think in terms of pointing towards the action, I do think we need to do the work. Jane Bolgatz talks about the importance of racial literacy. She talks about it in the context of classroom setting, that we need to talk about race and racism. We need to learn to talk about race and racism by talking about race and racism. And I think that is work that we need to continue to do as a sector, recognizing that we will make mistakes and it won't be easy and it won't be comfortable. But if we can't do that, how is it that we can reconfigure ourselves to attend to racism and to commit ourselves to pursuing racial justice? The second thing I would say, which follows that, sitting with, working with that discomfort, working with those ideas, those difficult ideas, is to consider why are we here as a sector. A couple of months ago, I wrote a piece off the back of Home Truths in Third Sector, and I suggested that the role of the voluntary sector should be about restoring wholeness to society, and that means a relentless focus on social justice and equity and racial justice as well. And I think what that means is serious corrective action, recognizing how issues of race, gender, class, geography, and so on limit the way that people can walk in the world. And I think one practical implication, well, just to kind of extend that a little bit. So one of the things that we talk about is, you know, with all this diversity stuff, that it's not just about changing the singer, it's about changing the song. So I think a lot of the diversity debate is too centered on who does the work, you know, so who's employed to do the work, who's on the board and so on. All of that is fine. But actually, I think really critical to change is not so much who does the work, although that can have a bearing, but it's the work itself. So if we are to change the singer and the song, I think one of the kind of critical recommendations that we talk about in Home Truth is, yes, you know, do all your internal EDI stuff, yeah, expand your notion of what excellence is, you know, change your the way you write job descriptions, person specs, all of that, absolutely. But one of the things that we argue for is the sector will only move forward on racial justice if we make it mission critical. So what we need organisations to do is change their missions to explicitly make the pursuit of racial justice central to why those organisations exist. And I think ultimately that is the way to move the sector, to make the sector accountable, I think in the earlier session, I think Natalie from Black Thrive talked about the ways one does kind of partnerships and how the mainstream sector is not always good at that in relation to working with racialized and minoritized organizations. I think changing organizations so that racial justice is critical to what they do does then have implications. Okay, for how can we do partnership? How is that meaningful? When do we move out the way? How do we put our skin in the game so that racial justice is not just a problem for and left to people who experience racism? The last thing I want to say, third and last thing, is really about hope. I think because we talked earlier, there was the thing about doom and gloom. It is to recognise, even in the carnage of this year, I mean, a lot of black and brown bodies have suffered, and that has brought attention, but to the issue of racial justice. I think it is really important to recognise the agency, the defiance, strength of spirit and survival of racialised people. There's a beautiful thing, if people have ever seen it, in the film The 13th, which is about kind of incarceration industrial complex in the US. And at the end of it, there's a beautiful scene of black people doing ordinary things, Halloween costumes, an elder looking over the Grand Canyon and so on. And I think kind of recognizing the power and the agency of people who are racialized is really important. That's one aspect of hope. I think the second is all of this additional attention. We are all here. I think there's a new receptivity to some of these questions, to having these discussions, and it's good that we're here trying to figure it out, trying to insist on the full humanity of black, brown, and racialized people, and to allow all people to have the full bandwidth to live their lives. That is something that's important, but we also know that these moments come and they can go. And so I think there is something about how do we hold on to this energy and ensure and insist that it stays with us as we reconfigure how we are as a sector and the change we want to see in society.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That's amazing, isn't it? Bringing those three sessions we've just heard there, it feels to me like we're I'm overusing an overused word over the last couple of weeks. We're on the cusp of a moment and a sense in time and our own lives, both as voluntary sector and as individuals, where something different can happen going forward. And it seems to me that there's something around how we ask for that, how we be that, and how we support others and build something very new going forward. We haven't had loads of questions in the chat box, so I'm just going to let Alison, it's the nepotism of chairing VS&W, ask one last question of our three panellists. That would be great.
Well, I was going to ask a particular question, but I suppose...
I think it links to that concept.
Yeah, I suppose I'm struck by the contributions and how they all fit together. And I think what we've just heard is around the role of the North in terms of thinking and the politics of the place. There's lots to consider. But I'm really struck by what Sanjit just said. The sector will only move forward on racial justice by making it mission critical. So I think there's a real challenge for all of us, and I think we need to take some practical actions away from this and from all of the sessions that we've had, because I think that's been a theme throughout all three sessions. And I think we need to think about what that means in terms of then the conversations we have with those metro mayors. And I suppose the other thing I'm really interested in taking away from the sessions is the whole notion about how hard it's going to be. So I suppose my question really to end was for you, Neil, in terms of, we hear lots of talk about Build Back Better and around growth, particularly in Greater Manchester. It's growth, 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 as you know, because your office is there. And I'm really interested in, what do you think the role of our sector can be? And I don't just mean social enterprises, but I mean the charitable and voluntary sector in terms of the small community groups and the larger charities, in what role we can play in what is likely to be degrowth.
It's a great question, and I think in other parts of the UK these conversations are real, and they're more prescient, and they're more woven into the policy architecture. And there is a growing sense that the civil society, community, voluntary sector have a role as partners with the local authority in delivery of public services, but also have a growing role in owning more of the economy, be it community land trusts, be it different forms of cooperatives that actually deliver more within the private sector economy. I think that is the next wave. We talk about community, voluntary and social enterprise sector, but a lot of the conversation focused on public services. I think it needs to focus much more on the ownership of land and ownership of more in the commercial economy, more social enterprises, more co-ops delivering in the private sector economy. And that in other administrations of the world is starting to emerge. We're seeing a rise of cooperatives, we're seeing a rise of different land ownership elements, which I think are so critical, including in Scotland. There's one thing when you're speaking there that maybe finish on, is that, and what's interesting to me from a metro mayoral point of view, or a local government point of view, is that somebody said to me something at the beginning of the pandemic, in our administrations, people are, one, scared, like all of us, and also only know what they've previously known. So if you're a director of economic development and you've spent 25 years and you're now senior, you've lived in a neoliberal world that's not done well-being economics, not done behavioural economics, not done neo-Keynesian, it's done neoliberalism. And so what you have is a combination of scared and a combination of done it the old way, is there's a stasis. There's a stasis of imagination, and there's a stasis of being fearful. Our sector, your sector, needs to be the creative spark, and that's what I'm talking about, this activism. There is another way. There's countries and places across the world that do it another way. That's what needs to be told over and over again to our technocrats and our politicians, the so-called left or progressive ones. There is another way. And look, I'm not being party political, but Ed Miliband yesterday talked about the Green New Deal, or a few days ago. What an excellent thing. That's our agenda. You know, that's a little bit of progressive stuff. Not brilliant, but it's there. There's little soup songs I think we can hang ourselves onto. Thanks. Thanks for the question. Sorry for going on again.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, we could go on for ages, couldn't we? But we're down to 35.
We're going to stop now, I'm afraid. Thank you to Sanjeev. I know Sarah's had to go off. Thank you to Neil. It's been a really good session, and I'm not sure if Ellie's still here and Paul, but thank you very much. And thank you for everybody in the chat and for the questions and making all your contributions. It feels like we need to build on this, if that's the right word, and make the most of the opportunities. I think we need to think through our relationships with many, many different groups of people and how we act on those and create some momentum and influence going forward. We've worked as VSW very much on a sub-regional footprint with different partnerships, but what's been amazing has been coming together at a Northwest footprint and having these conversations, and we need to make the most of those and think through how we build something that works for the Northwest as a whole alongside those sub-regional conversations. It feels like with the staff we've got now, we've got a chance to do that, and your support and help in doing that will make it happen for us, hopefully, is the challenge and the ambition going forward.
Thanks, Warren. I suppose my challenge now is to think about that Metro Mayor's event and whether they listen and we talk, And I think Sanjeev's challenge in the chat is if we can describe the new world, we can build it. And maybe that's the opportunity to get them to listen to us.
Yeah. So we need to think through the format of that, not just have it as a platform for
I've already been to one event this week where we couldn't see anyone else other than them two, and they talked at us for an hour for the living wage. So not interested in going to another one.
All right. Well, to try and turn it more into a dialogue and with some presentations on our side then. Sounds good. Thank you to everyone. And we'll be in touch. And I hope you enjoyed the third in our Festival of Northwest Thinking. It's been really challenging and great for me. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.